It just gets healthier and healthier. Guys, I'm back with another video. On my channel, I know I talk about imports a lot. Some of these games can become very, very expensive, especially if you only have eBay and no other choice because people are jacking up the prices. And it can be very intimidating and very discouraging sometimes. But the good news is there are a lot of really great games that are still super cheap, either because they just made a lot of them or they don't have a lot of notoriety yet. So in today's episode, I want to talk about some import retro games that are very affordable, that are really relatively quite cheap in the grand scheme of things. So as usual, I'm going to try to mostly focus on games that were only released in Japan. Might have to break that rule a couple times. And I'm going to stick to under $50 boxed complete. That really does limit you quite a bit, more than you might think. But there's still some really, really great games out there that you can have within that price range. I am dealing with prices in Japan. So if you see somebody on eBay selling this game for 3 times that much, they're just an asshole. Don't worry. So we're going to go from basically 8-bit up to 32, 64-bit. Let's get straight into it. Start out with Famicom. And yes, why not? First of all, this is Ninja Jajamaru Ginga Daisakusen. I did a review video of this. I called this one of my guilty pleasures. That doesn't mean it's a bad game by any means. It's just really cheap. And this was a series of video games by Jalico. This one is a full-on platformer. And it's really, really fun. It's not particularly complicated, but it's very beautiful, 8-bit, Famicom-esque experience, that really truly brings you back to that time of simplicity and that, really just raw 2-bit fun gaming. And this is like barely even $10. So if you see that, grab it. And one last one for the Famicom. This is Power Blazer. This is the Japanese version of Power Blade 1. Now, if I say Japanese version, that is a little misleading because they are completely different games. They totally reworked the American version. You could say the American version is better. In certain ways, you can shoot 8 directions. In the Japanese one, you can only shoot straight forward. It's much, much harder. But it's really fun. It's kind of a clunky Mega Man, basically. But it's a blast, and if you enjoy challenging games, it is really, really cool. And it's really cheap. It's barely even $30, I think even, and has a hard case. Next, let's get to the PC Engine. First of all, we'll do with the cards, the HU cards. My first choice is Makai Prince Dorobo-chan. Now, this is, again, a very simplistic platformer. It's not particularly difficult, but it has, that beautiful nostalgic feeling, of the 8 and 16-bit era. The music is, very childlike, very nice. It's just a friendly experience. And just because it's easy doesn't always necessarily mean that it's not worth your time. I like, really challenging games, but not always. So I can still enjoy this kind of game. This is probably 35 or something like that, even now. So I can definitely recommend this game. And this is actually the prequel to the game called Spike McFang on the Super Nintendo, which is a totally different genre of game. That was an action RPG. This is just a 2D platformer. And the other one is definitely Metal Stoker. I try to tell people about this game all the time. This is an overhead tank shooter, run and gun, I guess you would call, with a tank driving gun. It's made by Face, the people who made Honey on the Road, Honey in the Sky, and I do feel like it's their most polished game. A lot of different variety in the levels. It is basically a search and destroy game, but the level designs themselves are actually kind of varied. It's not always just the same thing. Really cool bosses, amazing soundtrack. This is probably $10 or $15. I mean, as far as PC Engine imports, first of all, it's one of the best ones that didn't come to America, and it also happens to be one of the cheapest. So definitely grab this if you are inclined at all to play PC Engine games. Those were the PC Engine cards, the HU cards, and of course, going to cover a couple CDs. There's tons of really good PC Engine CD games. Not all of them are really expensive. So first of all, take a look. This is Avenger. This is a vertical scrolling 2D shooter by Lasersoft with Neon Telenet. Now, their games were kind of known as being, you know, a lot of really cool presentation. You know, they always had anime cutscenes. The music was really great. The gameplay was hit or miss. Some of their games are very middle of the road. Some of them are quite poor. This one's actually really fun. I really honestly enjoy Avenger. If you've ever played Under Defeat, it's actually a bit similar where you can rotate your helicopter, you know, like 30 degrees or something like that, just a little bit to the left and the right, you know, so that you can shoot enemies to the side of you. And it works really well. It's actually really, really fun. Great music, as usual. And it's super duper cheap. It's probably like $10, something like that. So that is a worthwhile TurboGrafx CD or PC Engine CD game that you can have for next to nothing. And still shocked that this gets so little love. This is Chris's Adventure, Chris no Boken. This is actually a 2D platformer. It's the character's name is Chris, but it's a girl. It's not me, sadly. But this is a completely 2D platformer on the TurboGrafx CD. There are not a whole lot of platformers on the CD, actually. There's plenty on the HU cards, but not a whole lot of CDs. And this one is actually really fun. It's actually really well done. The levels are not long, but there's like 8 worlds with 2 levels each. And they all, the control is really crisp. The graphics are competent. Some of the music is excellent. And it just plays well. And there's a lot of really cool ideas with the platforming. It's a really, really fun platformer. And it's only like, I don't know, $20, $25. It's just mind-boggling. So I do recommend Chris's Adventure. As for the Sega Genesis, I've said this in other videos, most of the great games went to America, and the few good ones that didn't are generally very expensive. So I'm just going to introduce a couple games that were also released in the West, but the Japanese versions are super cheap, really great games. First of all, this is the Japanese version of Mystic Defender. It's called Kujaku 2. It's based on a comic series, and you know, probably most people know about Mystic Defender, and I doubt the US version is all that expensive. But if you want the Japanese version with really cool artwork on the cover, you can have it for $15 or something like that. It's a really, really nice game. It plays like an arcade game, but it's not an arcade game. But I mean, this one really has atmosphere, and it's super duper cheap. And again, it was released in America, but Marvel Land. This is an arcade conversion, and it is harder than it looks. You see the graphics, and it kind of looks very kiddie, or you know, geared towards children. But it's a very hard platformer. Thankfully, there's a password system. And again, this is probably, you know, $15 complete or something like that. And I mean, normal mode is super hard, so I might have to try hard mode at some point. A very fun platformer though, really, really great game by Namco, and it kind of gets overlooked. Next, let's look at the Super Famicom. Despite the fact that some of the notorious Super Famicom imports are super expensive, there are still really great games that are not expensive yet at all. Let's look at a couple of those. First of all, this is Sandler's Adventure, Sandora no Daiboken. This is a 2D platformer, another one by Namco, and to be completely honest with you, it's very difficult. It's one of the hardest platformers I've ever seen in my entire life. But there's a lot to it. There really is deep gameplay in it. I think there's like 3 different types of super jumps. There's all these kind of like different button presses. So if you don't have the instructions, it's like you don't know what you're doing and it seems impossible. But it is possible, and it's a really fun game. There's a storyline that goes with it. There's tons of variety in the level designs. It's huge, it's long, and it is an excellent, excellent game. And I mean, to be the real copy on real hardware, I mean, is a big accomplishment. So if you're into tough games, highly, highly recommend this. And also, here is a sneaky one that goes under the radar. This game is called Noigia. And if that's supposed to be English, I have no idea what language that was supposed to be. It's called Noigia in Japanese. They call it an action RPG. It's basically more like an overhead action game that, has some action RPG elements. It's made by Wolf Team, which is kind of interesting. And it is not particularly long. It's not that difficult, but there is real depth to the world view. It really makes you feel like you're kind of on an adventure in this, weird alternate land. This was one of the first games I had ever gotten when I came to Japan for the first time. It was probably the Japanese game I came home and completed first. And the really interesting thing about it is that the music was done by Takahashi Yukihiro, who was a member of Yellow Magic Orchestra, for those of you who are into Japanese techno pop. And this is how I found out about him and that group. I didn't know anything about it before. So some kind of interesting history in there. Next, let's look at the Sega Saturn. Yes, there are still good Saturn games that are not extraordinarily expensive. Hard to believe, but it's true. First of all, Silhouette Mirage. Yeah, it's actually not that expensive. In Japan, it's like $40 or something like that. So it does fit into this list. Obviously, on eBay, people are probably trying to overcharge you because they're dickheads. But screw them. It is worth $40. And it's an extremely good game by Treasure. Probably most people who, enjoy Treasure's games know that. It's a really cool 2D platformer, really colorful, lots of variety in gameplay. It has this kind of dual two-color system that they, use sometimes in their games. $40, for God's sakes, yeah, get Silhouette Mirage. And if you're looking for a good shooter on the Saturn that doesn't cost a fortune, there is still Sokyu Gurentai. Yes, this game is not particularly expensive, maybe $35 or something like that. This is an excellent shooter. The system is similar to Layer Section or Galactic Attack, where you have a standard shot, or then you have a beam that will lock on to enemies, but you can only use one at a time in this game, so you do have to think about which weapon type is best for, any particular situation. Excellent game. The soundtrack is by Hitoshi Sakimoto. Most people know him with Base Escape. Obviously, that's going to be excellent music. So, if you're not willing to pay $400 for Hyper Duel, you can pick up Sokyu Gurentai for like $35. Highly recommended. As for the PlayStation 1, there are tons of great import PS1 games that are still super cheap just because so few people know about them outside of Japan. I am going to stick to two. First of all, the most obvious one is Gunner's Heaven. This is, most people know it as the Gunstar Heroes clone. It is a 2D side view run and gun, kind of like Contra and Gunstar Heroes. Excellent game, extremely well done, completely 2D game on the PlayStation 1. It's early in the PlayStation's lifespan. It was released in 1995, and it's only like $25 without the spine card at least. So you can have this, for not very much money, and it is a wonderful 2D shooter. It's extremely difficult, so prepare yourself for that. But for the price, most games of this type would, skyrocket in price, but there's probably a lot of copies of it, so you can have this anytime. You really should. And one more that is just becoming so overlooked is Hermie Hopperhead. This was supposed to be Sony's answer to Mario, basically, but it was completely 2D, so, Sony of America just skipped over it. And it is a quite deep 2D platformer with a whole bunch of different secret pathways and all these extra levels and stuff. It's very, very cheap. It's like not even $5, if that. It just gets no respect. Probably because there's probably a whole lot of copies, first of all. There's a greatest hits version. It can be very difficult to get comfortable with the jump control in this game. It's extremely sensitive, and the amount of space that you have where you can jump on an enemy and actually land on them is like much thinner and tighter than most 2D platformers. So that really takes some time to get used to. In the beginning, you're just kind of like, oh my god, is this even possible? But once you do, it's a really good 2D platformer. It's a great game, and it's so cheap. So if you see it, I do highly recommend getting Hermie Hopperhead. And since it is technically in the same generation as the PlayStation and Saturn, I'm just going to introduce one Nintendo 64 game. Most Nintendo 64 games were 3D, which is really not my thing, but there is definitely one Japan-only N64 game that you should really try to get, if at all possible, and that is Sin and Punishment, Tsumitobatsu. This is a masterpiece of a game by Treasure. It's kind of, an on-rails shooter. The control is hard to get used to in the beginning. They kind of, made it such that you can control the gun sight and the character completely separately, but you have to use the entire Nintendo 64 controller, which can be a little tricky, but it can be done. And obviously, it's a Treasure game, so, the boss patterns are really intricate. Really gotta learn them. Music is extraordinary by, Toshiya Yamanaka. And they really pushed the Nintendo 64 as far as they could. The graphics are quite nice for the system. And it's only like $35 or $40 here in Japan, boxed, even now, despite the fact that it was only released here, and it does generally have good reception. So, I mean, if you like Treasure games, you gotta have Sin and Punishment. The sequel on the Wii, obviously, is really cool. It's a great game. But the original is also an extraordinary game. So if you got $40 laying around, grab this. You may have noticed that I skipped over the Sega Master System. There's good reason for that. It's because the Master System was not very successful in Japan. And most of the Master System games were released in America and Europe. I don't know. If you don't include the SG-3000 games and stuff like that, there's probably like 5 Japan exclusives. And they're not all that important. It's like Solomon's Key and the arcade conversion of Rygar and a couple other things. Whereas actually a ton of Japanese developed games for the Master System were not released in Japan. And I've just been kind of getting into that recently. So that's a completely different story, but basically there's not really any worthwhile Japan exclusive Sega Master System games. So that's why I didn't talk about it. So if you really want to get into, Japan exclusive games, you want to start importing but you're on a budget, it can be extremely intimidating, but, keep working. There's a lot of great games that are still not very expensive. Be careful on eBay. If you see something and you're sure that it's priced way over what it's actually worth, then it truly is screw those people. Because there are great games that are not expensive yet. And remember, some of the best or some of the most expensive games are not always the best ones. Some of them are, but some of them, just become expensive on sheer numbers, because there's not many of them. So I hope that this introduction of some of these games gives you some suggestions that you might be able to find cool Japanese games that do not cost a fortune. Thanks a lot for watching the video to the very end. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. I will see you next week.